Hello, it's Gino here, and welcome to another video, this time on the Sicilian defense. And today we'll have a look at the poison pawn variation. Um, and yeah, after the moves, pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, d6, d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3 and a6, we get the Najdorf variation. Now the most aggressive continuation for white here is bishop to g5. After bishop to g5, the most popular try is pawn to e6. And now we see two critical moves that define the poison pawn variation. So pawn to f4 and queen to b6. Now after this pawn to f4 move, the bishop can no longer come to c1 to defend the b2 square. So black plays queen to b6, attacking the pawn. Queen to d2. Gambiting the b2 pawn is white's idea. I mean, white wants to, gain time. Whilst black is grabbing pawns, white wants to use the time to develop an attack against the black king. This leads to hair-raising complications. A simpler way for white to play, if I may add, is instead of queen to d2, white can play this little trap with pawn to a3. And the idea here is that queen takes b2 would be very bad because of knight to a4. And the queen has got no squares, so black would be losing material. So after something like pawn to a3, black is ill-advised to capture the pawn on b2. He can play some other developing move. But yeah, back to the position after queen to b6. So yeah, we see this little trick by white, but not too many people will fall for it, especially if they are experienced. But yeah, the key move here is queen to d2, leading to the poison pawn variation. And now it's probably what just following a game. It's an email correspondence game in 2014 between Lefebvre and Bonehill. Hopefully I pronounced the names correctly. And black took the challenge and played queen takes b2, grabbing the pawn. Okay. And now we see rook to b1, so putting the rook on an active square. And queen to a3, only move for the queen. And now the key move for white, pawn to f5. Now this looks like a strange move for white if you're not familiar with the position. But the idea is to try and create, a square to try and take control of the d5 square. So for example, just to illustrate the point, if black were to play pawn takes, bishop takes f6, removing one piece that's covering the d5 square, and after say pawn takes f6, knight to d5, there are a few threats here. Knight to b6 is one, knight to c7 is one. So yeah, this wouldn't be a a position I'd recommend for black to try and defend. I think in fact he's already losing even with best play from this position. So yeah, so going back to the position after pawn to f5, as we have just seen, black is ill-advised to capture on f5. By far the most popular move here in this position is knight to c6, which leads to, I mean, there have been hundreds if not thousands of games played from this position, and it's with best play should be about equal. So for example, after something like pawn takes e6, pawn takes e6, knight takes c6, pawn takes c6 and e5, white will give up material and hope that his initiative would compensate for the material, and yeah, it seems to be the case in lots of practical games. But yeah, going back to this game, between Lefebvre and Bonehill, after f5, rather than the more solid continuation knight to c6, Bonehill played pawn to e5. And yeah, this position is known in theory to be slightly favorable for white, and we'll see why. So white starts with bishop takes f6, and capturing one of black's only developed pieces other than the queen. And after pawn takes f6, it's important to note here, I mean, white has to be careful here. There's a threat of bishop to h6. And if queen takes h6, queen takes c3. So to avoid this, white just has to be careful and play knight to b3. So this makes bishop h6 a silly move. Now, knight b3, apart from preventing bishop h6, also makes knight d5 a possibility, as we'll see in future. And now bishop to e7. So it's probably just taking stock of the position. And so white is a pawn down rather, but as compensation he has control of the d5 square. Black has got these doubled pawns on the f file. The king wouldn't be safe on the king side because of these weak dark squares around the king. And white has simply developed a few more pieces. So let's see how this unfolds. So bishop c4 is a good way to start. And the point of this move is that black cannot castle straight away. Well, he can, but then he'll be faced with a strong attack after something like knight to d5, attacking the bishop on e7. And if bishop to d8 to defend the c7 and b6 squares, which are currently weak. Queen h6 shows the problems that black has. I mean, knight takes f6 is one threat. Knight to d2, rook to b3 to g3 is another possibility. So for example, after something like knight to d7, in this position, white can simply play knight to d2, and yeah, we can see the rook to b3 and rook to g3 is coming with a crushing attack. And so just going back to the position after bishop to c4, this actually creates some practical problems for black. And so as well as developing a piece for white and preparing castling, it also presents some practical problems for black. In the game, black decided to go knight to d7 first, covering the f6 square, I suppose. But then after castles kingside by white, he realized he still could not castle kingside, because this move would have been met by knight to d5 again, with a similar variation to what we saw before, because after bishop to d8, queen to h6, and knight to d2 and rook to b3 and g3, black's in trouble. So going back to the position after white just castle kingside, black instead decided to play h5. So for now, black's made the decision to keep the king in the center, hoping that this pawn formation here would keep the king safe, but at the same time try and counterattack on the king side. But this is a little bit dubious, I'd say, especially when your queen side is as poorly developed as this. We'll see how the game unfolds. So after the pawn to h5, white takes advantage of his control of the d5 square, so he goes knight to d5. Now this bishop is quite key to protecting, key squares around the black king. So black, understandably, retreats with the bishop to d8. And now we see knight e3. Yep, white still keeping control of the d5 square, and of this file. Pawn to h4 was played by black, and this turned out to be a bad move actually. If we go back one move, another try based on computer analysis shows rook to b8, intending b5, would have given black some counterplay. But going back to the position after knight to e3, black played pawn to h4 in the game. White decided to play just a quiet move before deciding on how best to continue his attack. He put the king in the corner because, as you can see, there's the possibility of the bishop appearing on this diagonal and g1 to a7 diagonal at some point, so he put the king on h1 instead. And now the bishop arrived a little bit too late. I mean, just going back one move, a better try here would have been perhaps knight to b6, just asking this bishop what exactly are you doing on c4, and this might have been the way to play for black to try and keep things under control. But yeah, but it's a bit tricky to find moves like this when you're so poorly developed. So anyway, bishop to b6, but then came the brilliant move, bishop takes f7 check. So just taking stock of the position here, white has developed all his pieces. Black is effectively playing without his king side. Well, did I say king side? No, queen side. So yeah, this kind of justifies sacrificing a piece, because I mean, queen to d5 check is a possibility. Knight to c4, hitting the queen and the bishop. Discovered attack on the b file. And so yeah, I mean, lots of things were pointing towards a sacrifice like this being possible. So after taking on f7, king takes f7, and queen to d5 check followed. And after king to g7, knight to c4. Now, there's nothing black can do to avoid losing another pawn, the pawn on d6. I mean, the queen's threatened. She doesn't really have many squares. I mean, she can go to a4 or a2. In the game, black opted to at least win a pawn and put pressure on another one for his suffering. But then after knight takes d6, the strong threat to queen f7 forced black to play rook h7. Just going back one move, rook f8, trying to prevent queen f7 would have been a better try. But then I think white's attack would have just continued after, say, queen to d1, the strong threat, an unavoidable threat being queen to g4 check, and maybe even something like queen takes h4, rook to a1 to a3 to g3 with a strong attack. So going back to the game, black opted for rook to h7 instead, and now starts a series of interesting moves. So queen c4 first, and it's a very sneaky move. White has a stronger threat, a bigger threat, which is rook to a1, and if queen to b2, rook f to b1, trapping the queen. Yeah, black was alert to this and played queen to a3, so at least now, if rook to a1, queen takes d6. So yeah, white realized black wasn't falling for the trap, so yeah, switch mode and went for queen to f7 check. I mean, starting a mating attack, or at least if not mate, winning lots of material. Just going back a move, it's just worth pointing out here the knight takes c8 would have thrown away most of the advantage after something like king to h8, because now if you look at the position, both sides have roughly equal material, and black's queen side has managed to be untangled. So yeah, so just going back a move. So after queen to a3, queen to f7 check was played instead. I mean, white wasn't gonna try and free up black's pieces for him. I mean, look at the rook and look at the bishop in the corner here. And it's not a very pretty sight. So yeah, queen f7 check. The only sensible move was king to h8. Sorry, king to h6 would be queen to g6 checkmate. And so that would be embarrassing. So after queen to f7 check, king to h8, queen to e8 check, forcing the king back up and controlling the 8 rank. King to g7, and now rook b to d1. The simple threat here is knight takes c8 and followed by rook takes d7. In desperation, black tried bishop to c5, at which point, yeah, white could have continued with his knight takes c8 and rook takes d7 continuation, but saw an equally strong continuation and went knight takes c5. Actually, maybe even stronger, because the point is that after queen takes e5, which happened in the game, and queen to g6 check, king to h8, only sensible square, rook to d3. The rook on f1 could one day end up on f3 and g3. In some lines, but I mean in the game, black opted for queen takes c2, trying to at least grab some material whilst he was under pressure. But after queen to e8 check and king to g7, rook f to d1, again with this threat of knight takes c8 and rook takes d7. Yeah, not having any sensible moves to play, black tried a5 to see if he could bring this rook into play, but then after the unsurprising knight takes c8, yeah, he realized rook takes c8 wasn't possible because the rook takes d7 with a mating attack. So let's just see that. So after that, check, king to h6, queen to g6. Yeah. So just going back, after knight takes c8, he tried knight to f8 just to try and cover some squares around the king. But after the simple rook to d8, black resigned. I mean, there's no defense against queen takes f8. I mean, something like queen to c5 would actually have been met by one of the rooks to d7 check. So let's say rook here check, and the point being that if king to h8, rook takes f7 check, king takes h7, queen to f7 check, and here's something like king to h8, queen to f6 check, and so on with a winning attack. So yeah, just going back to the opening position after queen to b6, yeah, introducing the poison pawns, and white continued in typical fashion with queen to d2, and after queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen to a3, key move, pawn to f5, and this was a point where black went astray. He could have played knight to c6 and gone for the well-known equalizing continuation, but opted for e5 instead and lost in a very interesting game. So yeah, that was it on the poison pawn variation. I hope you liked this one, and please like, share and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.